So a while ago I made a video about 8 Mac minis I got for very cheap, and I've done a little experiment with various operating systems to see which of them runs better on old outdated Apple computers like those. And personally, that's just how I learned the best, not just by watching videos or reading up on things, because for me, having first-hand experiences in life is how I'm able to understand things properly. And there were a bunch of things that I've learned, for example about Linux or how to properly open up one of these guys, and yes, I did read your horrified comments. Some guys who worked on these before, I guess, got an aneurysm when they saw me poking this thing with a flathead. And the most shocking thing that I've realized when doing that video was that you can in fact upgrade the CPU. Now, I'm used to seeing that feature on older or pro-grade Apple desktops, like on Macintosh and the Power Macintosh line of products, or on Power Macs or Mac Pros. But it never occurred to me that such a thing was possible on lower-end, newer consumer-grade Apple products like this Mac Mini. Wow. And this is in contrast to what we've been seeing in last decade and a half, with Apple making their computers not only less expandable, but also less serviceable. So it was a breath of fresh air seeing this bit of engineering from a time long gone, when I guess manufacturers actually put out products you could upgrade yourself. And that immediately gave me an idea, since I had a bunch of identical models. Apart from testing out operating systems on them, we had to see just how much of a difference can we make with upgrades that were available for users to do. And I've legitimately heard people say, oh, who cares, it's not like upping the memory, storage, or anything else will make a drastic difference, since there are other bottlenecks and you're just better off buying a new computer if you need to make all those upgrades anyhow. So let's see, I still have a couple of these base model 2006 Mac Minis, and we'll see just how much of a difference a couple of simple upgrades can do, and why it's such a shame that you can't do this at all nowadays, at least not with Apple products. I've taken two of the lower end Mac Minis, the Core Solo models, with 512 megs of RAM and a 60GB original Seagate hard drive. Last time we took a look at these, we were using Core Duo models, so I was very curious as to how these single core models would perform. And we're going to leave one of them stock, or as stock as possible, so that we have that out of the box experience, or as close to it as possible. And the other one, well, we're going to max it out in pretty much all the ways I know how. The idea being to compare the two and to see just what kind of a difference you could make back in the day when you still had the ability to upgrade the hardware you buy. So we're going to start by cracking this guy open, and yeah, I do read all of the comments, and many of you said that I should have used a butter knife or a putty knife to undo the clips around the perimeter, so that's what I've tried. And yes, it does make it easier, but I stand by my words that they could have just put a couple of screws underneath, since plastic clips are not only annoying but also break, especially after decades of sitting. The plastic just gets brittle with age. Anyway, I already know how to take these things apart since I had to do it so many times for the last video. But this time we're not going to stop at just a memory and a thermal paste upgrade, because we're popping out that single core CPU and we're going to be installing a Core 2 Duo, a T7200, which is a 2GHz 64-bit mobile variant. And while this isn't the highest clock speed this socket accepts, the T7600 I wanted to get was like 5 times the cost. So I just went with this one. So after popping the old CPU out, I've installed a new one in its place, and it was time to put some new thermal paste on it. Plug in the thermal sensor and reattach that heatsink, which, these stupid white pogo pins are something I really don't miss on newer motherboards. But to make it easier to reinstall, I just push them in using a tip of my screwdriver, the bit holder, which has a dome end shape that fits over them quite nicely. And in this configuration, the system has access to double the memory, so 4 gigs. I've read that in some cases only 3 gigs are recognized, but I guess we'll see what's up with that once we actually get the machine up and running. I've installed a 4 gig stick, and this is actually higher speed, so it's 800 megahertz. However, if you install it in a system with a 667 megahertz bus speed, it just throttles it down and it works just fine. After that, it was time to move on to the third thing I wanted to upgrade, which is that old, slow, low-capacity hard drive. And I was actually amazed how well these performed in my last test. These are 20-year-old spinning rust relics, and yet all 8 of them still function admirably. But it was time to pop it out and install this 240 gig Kingston SATA SSD, and I know this one works since I've pulled it out of another Mac not too long ago. And after dusting everything off and making sure I didn't forget anything, I reassembled it just enough so I could test it out before putting it all back together proper. So I've hooked up my little monitor, video and power, and yeah, the thing powered right up, which made me very happy, although I didn't hear any beeps or sounds. It showed that it had nothing to boot from, which is fine since that SSD is formatted. So I've popped in my bootable USB, and I'm going to be installing Snow Leopard, and before you comment, yes, I am aware that I can install El Capitan with this configuration, but the maximum supported OS for the Core Solo model is 10.6.8, and I really wanted to have a comparable operating system for this video, since again we're going to be comparing the two. Unfortunately, after booting into the install environment, I could see no available drives to install the OS to. Upon checking the disk utility, I could see that not only was the drive not present, but the optical drive was also missing. So I've shut the machine down and checked the ribbon cable connecting the two to the motherboard, and after restarting, sure enough, the both showed up. I proceeded to install Snow Leopard, and yeah, installing it from that USB to the SSD immediately felt much faster than when I had to do it on the hard drive. After perhaps 15-20 minutes, I was back at the desktop and everything seemed to be working very well. I've checked the system settings and I was happy to see that the machine was recognizing that Core 2 Duo processor just fine. However, I could see that only 2 gigs of RAM were showing up. Now at first I thought that was because you had to install that maximum of 4 gigs by having 2 gig sticks in both slots. So that's what I wanted to try next. I had to dig out some extra RAM sticks to experiment with, and I've managed to find 2 sticks of 2 gig 667 MHz DDR2 memory, and after popping it in, yeah, it would just make noises and not boot up. I've then proceeded to try out every single combination. I thought perhaps the slots were bad or the sticks were faulty. I've tried lower capacity ones like 512 megs alongside that 2 gig module, but nothing would work. And that was of course because I haven't flashed the new firmware. I just thought having that CPU would be enough, but apparently no. I had to push the new 2.1 firmware through, which is super easy thanks to this handy utility provided by DOSDude's awesome repository of highly useful stuff. After running it, turning off the machine and then holding down the power button until it beeped, I freaked out a little since I started getting some weird glitchy graphics.
Whoa. Okay. Oh, that's not good. Let's restart.
But fortunately, after a restart, it booted up successfully, and lo and behold, after checking the system info, I could indeed see the new 2.1 firmware. Awesome.
Okay, so at this point we have the 2.1 model identifier, and that tells me that the firmware has been updated. So I guess we'll try installing that extra RAM now and see whether or not it takes it.
After that, I've tried installing the 2 RAM sticks, and I finally got the 4 gigs to show up.
Okay, let's go check the RAM. Awesome! 4 gigs!
Out of curiosity, I've actually tried installing some more RAM, but it would just still report 4 gigs, so that's what I went with. And yeah, we have not only maxed out this thing, we've basically transformed this computer into a new generation, which is an awesome thing and something that you should be able to do and still today. I mean, it'd be awesome if instead of buying a whole new machine, you could just upgrade the aging components. Like, say you bought an M1 Mac years back and you're not happy with how it performs, for a fraction of the price you could get like an M3. I know it's not how it works with everything being consolidated and integrated nowadays, but that's essentially what we've done here. Yeah, I had a hard time plugging that freaking antenna back in. Jesus. So yeah, it kinda took me a while, but I finally got this thing buttoned up. And while this model certainly isn't my favorite Mac to take apart and work on, it's still infinitely better than what we have nowadays. So before running our tests, it was time to prepare the other machine, which, I mean, there are no upgrades to do here. I've just booted it up, confirmed that it worked, and I went on to install the new operating system on it. However, upon running the installation, I've gotten an error message saying that this machine doesn't have enough RAM to run Snow Leopard. And after checking the system requirements, yeah, crap, I totally forgot that you needed at least 1 gig of RAM, and this poor thing only had 512 by default. And now I had a dilemma to sort out. I'd either install something less demanding on both of these, like Tiger, or just add 512 megs to the Core Solo model. And since some software I wanted to test wouldn't run under Tiger, I just said screw it, and I've added the 512 megs to the machine, so instead of it having 8 times less memory, it now only has 4 times, which is fine. And with that, the installation was on its way. The first thing I've actually installed was a cumulative 10.6.8 update, which, I mean, does many things, but most importantly, it enables Snow Leopard to read exFAT formatted drives, which in my case is important since I have a bunch of games and software on my external hard drive. I wanted to test a couple of things side by side: gaming, comparing the performance and speed, operating system tasks like copying files, web browsing, as well as running Geekbench. So let's kick things off by doing something fun, running UT 2004 here with the frame counter turned on so that we can monitor the performance. And I have to mention that with games, depending on what you're running, you're going to be depending on the graphics chip, which is one thing these systems share. They both have 64 megs of VRAM. And certain games might be more processor or memory dependent, while others might lean more on your GPU. With that being said, I mean, we pretty much get double the number of frames on average, with that Core 2 Duo on the right blasting through with around 40 to 60 FPS, in some cases even more that on average, while on the single core model is left in the dirt, around 20 to 30 FPS on average. Now, don't get me wrong, I mean, it's not unplayable by any means, but the gameplay is just so much smoother and it feels very comparable to my MacBook Pro 2007, which I owned back in the day and I played this very game on. And yeah, this is the level of performance I remember. Call of Duty 2 here, again, very similar story, with the lower end model just being glitchy. And I do realize much of that is due to that slow hard drive, and it's really hard to tell what improvement bump is linked to the memory or the CPU, but overall we got between 15 to 25 FPS on average. Again, playable, but not overly so. And on the higher end model, we can comfortably game all we want, with 30 to 60 FPS depending on what's being loaded on the screen, and this just kept me hooked. I kinda wanted to just keep playing, but in the end I wanted to move to some more demanding titles from the mid-2000s, which is of course Doom 3. And yeah, I was very curious how that thing would perform in just 64 megs of RAM, and sure enough it wasn't very pretty. This is one of those titles that really requires more GPU power than most people had back in the day, which is why we see gameplay like this on both systems. And I can honestly say I wouldn't enjoy playing this on any of these, but I did feel like the Core 2 Duo was giving me a better overall result with slightly better frame rates, question mark. But yeah, single digits all over, it wasn't very pretty. But I did want to run the Doom 3 time demo, which netted around 5.6 FPS average on the low-end machine, and around 7.8 FPS on the higher end. So yeah, they both suck ass, but the maxed out model sucks a little less ass. Anyway, yeah, could you believe gaming was something that Apple actually cared about at one point in time? And I never understood why they had to give up on gaming. I mean, I had all the cool titles in the mid to late 2000s, and I had a blast playing them on my MacBook. And I couldn't get the frame counter going with San Andreas here because Apple, but you can immediately tell just how much better that Core 2 Duo model is. I mean, just looking at it, eyeballing it, I'd say we're getting a 30% improvement on the frame rates. And one more gaming and CPU related task I wanted to try was emulation. I've tried both N64 and PS1 emulation, and honestly there wasn't a massive difference. So I guess it was time to get this thing online, which I did using my favorite browser for these old systems, and it's called Interweb. And while it does play YouTube correctly, it does so at a lower bitrate, only 360p and no higher. And I have to say that while making this video, I was constantly surfing the web and downloading files I was missing, like that firmware update, right on this guy, the Core 2 Duo model, and it felt pretty good to be honest. On that other single core machine, yeah, not so much, especially with the things like video playback. While it does play YouTube correctly, it does so at a lower bitrate, only 360p and no higher. On that other guy, we get 480p by default, and at 720p, it does drop frames, but hey, that's something. Transferring files was another expected win for the upgraded machine, since it does have an SSD, and transferring my 8.4 gig test file from that external HDD took around 3 minutes, with around 50 to 60 megabytes per second transfer rate, and again, we have to take the write speed of my external drive into consideration. The other machine did the same job in around 4.5 minutes with around 30 megabytes per second transfer rate. Last benchmark to run was Geekbench, and I mean, to me, those numbers don't really matter too much because they're just that, numbers, and I really care most about actual real-life performance. That being said, I was still surprised to see that the upgraded model scored twice as high with around 2800 points, while the lower end just had 1400. And that actually falls in line with some of the performance we've seen, although I wouldn't necessarily say these updates made the new machine twice as fast in all regards. And honestly, I mean, the fact that you can still get a decent experience online with a 20-year-old machine just by giving it a couple simple and cheap updates is mind-boggling to me. Granted, these updates wouldn't be cheap back in the day this thing was new, but say it was 2012 or 2013, you had this computer which was a couple of years old, you could throw a couple of easily obtainable and inexpensive parts and have an awesome time. By that time, we've gotten DDR3 RAM, and DDR2 was dirt cheap. SSDs were coming down in prices, and along with the CPU you could have gotten used for cheap, like the rest of the parts. I mean, it would literally transform your computer. You could do things you couldn't have done before, and it'd be something comparable to buying a new, or at least newer machine. And man, is that something that I miss nowadays, since we've practically been stripped of the ability to upgrade any of the components we've easily managed to swap not 15 years ago. And in my video about things that we've lost on Macs throughout the years, I've covered various features that just disappeared, and this little Mac Mini ticks all of the boxes for me from that bygone age of serviceability. You could have upgraded your memory, upgrade your storage, your CPU, it has an IR sensor, it reads and burns CDs and DVDs, it's easily serviceable, it has a ton of ports, and it was affordable back in its day. Okay, the one thing that you can't upgrade is the GPU, and it doesn't have a battery since it's not a notebook, but other than that, I mean, what a nice little machine this was. And I have no illusions about Apple. I mean, they're getting away with removing features because they can, and you'd be surprised how little most consumers actually care about all of these things. And the fact they're able to listen, perhaps not to their customers, but to the marketplace responding to their backwards policies, is evident, given that they've brought back features like the MagSafe, HDMI ports, and card readers on their higher-end machines, as well as removable storage on their new M4 Mac Minis, and the new non-butterfly keyboard they abandoned after getting flack from customers and getting sued. So people, we're not supposed to be okay with this, and if you vote with your wallet and common sense and refuse to stand for that sort of behavior, not just from Apple, they're unfortunately not the only manufacturer doing this crap, there's a much higher chance of them actually going back to what used to be the standard. So yeah, this was my little homage to that upgradability, proving that it really does matter, it does make a difference, and it's overall awesome. And if you enjoyed me yapping about old Apple hardware, there's plenty of that here on my channel. So you might want to check out some of my other videos, or you might want to even consider subscribing. I do these videos every week, and if you'd like to support what I do, you can do so on Patreon for just $1 a month, or more if you'd like. If you'd like to chat with me and other users, you can join our Discord server. All the links will be in the video description. Thanks, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers.